Good evening, everyone. My name is Emily Benn from Tortoise, and I'm delighted to be editing tonight's Thinking, looking at the online safety bill and asking, is it a danger to freedom of expression? The key question being, how do you draw the correct balance between freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the harm that speech can cause other people, particularly in the context of social media? And the word harm is something I'm going to come back to, I think, a lot over the course of this session. We're having this discussion in the context of, a decade or more of a huge change, a technological change in the way that we think about human communication and the volume of it. And the online safety bill is an attempt to, in a regulatory way, catch up to so many of those developments to protect users, particularly children, from harmful online content, and force technology and search firms to do more to prevent the proliferation of some of the more distressing and indeed illegal material. For those that have not studied the detail of the bill, it puts a big onus on technology firms themselves, gives power to the Secretary of State in the UK, and gives Ofcom, the regulator, a huge amount of new power in the context of fines and indeed pursuing criminal sanctions against members of search firms that are not fulfilling the new code of conduct that will be that are going to be made between these firms and Ofcom in due course. It's a mammoth bill. There's a lot to talk about, and I admit I come at this with no particular expertise, which is why I'm so delighted that we have three guests to guide us through it for the next hour, who do have a huge broad width of expertise to help us think about this central tension when thinking about the bill. Jim Killock, who is Executive Director of the Open Rights Group. Hi, Jim. Thank you very much. Silky Carlo, who is Director of Big Brother Watch. Silky, very nice to see you again. And our very own Tortoise's Matthew Dancona, Editor and Partner, and who, in his most recent book, draws on many of these themes. If you haven't read it, you should. But also, this is a thinking, so we really want to hear from all of you. My colleague Seb is editing the chat. He said hello. Please pitch in. I'll come to you, many of you as possible. Share thoughts, articles, you name it, because there's a lot to get through. I want to start, if I might, by just going in turn to everyone. I mentioned earlier, this bill makes a lot of changes for technology companies themselves, gives new power to the Secretary of State, and a lot of new kind of regulatory power to Ofcom. In the very broadest sense, before I get to the questions more detailed on the tension of freedom of expression and the difficulties that this bill causes to that freedom, can I just ask you to give an overview of how you see the bill and the things that you think are most concerning, especially with the new onerous changes to those three groups of people? Can I start with you, Jim, please?
Yeah, well, what I would actually do is maybe just start with what's the right way of doing this, and then we can compare and see whether this is the right way. And I think we can all admit that there's a problem, right? There's a problem with not just the behaviour of individuals, but the incentives for content online. And it is absolutely the case that a lot of unpleasant behavior is incentivized, and a lot of unpleasant, or at least not very good content, is also incentivized. I might ask why that is. Well, what is driving that? And that clearly is the attention market, right? We've got essentially a sort of tabloidization of everyday speech and everyday interactions, because the things that are good for social media companies are those which basically help sell adverts. And that means people interacting with content. What kind of content do people want to interact with? Well, it's the controversial, it is the surprising, the unusual, the shocking. And guess what? It's easiest to do that when you are lying, exaggerating, telling untruths, being unpleasant. So the market somehow has ended up serving us badly. And that's because we're not the customers. We are the fuel to the real customers, the advertisers. So is this bill going to address that? That's the first question you need to have in your mind. And the second thing I think you have to ask is, what kind of ways do you regulate the speech of individuals in semi-private environments. And of course, the two models we have are broadcast regulation, where Ofcom, as a broadcast regulator, tells companies are extremely powerful and very monopolistic and have single editorial systems, determine exactly what is going to be said on their broadcast channels. That we have that model. And that seems appropriate where there are these huge monopoly power, and it really is editorially controlled. But that's not the internet. The internet is lots and lots of individuals. The other model we have is press regulation. And of course, everybody says, you don't give state regulation to press, because that will just mean the state control of the press. So you would think that the press was a better model to apply in terms of regulation. That is to say, you want independent regulation, because the press equally are quite possible and quite likely to get things wrong and not always draw the right line. But you don't want the state doing it. So it needs to be independent of the state and independent of the press, whatever regulates. That's hard to achieve. We've seen that over the last 10 years. But that is not the model we have here. We have basically a bill which says we'll have a duty of care. That's to say, a kind of idea of somehow finding harm and getting platforms to identify and remove things which are harmful. But it actually isn't a duty of care. It's a duty to do what the Secretary of State says is harmful, that you must deal with. So I think basically we've got the very, very wrong model. And I think there is a right way of doing it, which is to put the consumers in control. And we'll talk more about how you do that later, I'm sure. But to me, the first thing here is this is a market problem and a regulatory problem which can't be solved by saying, we don't like Mark Zuckerberg making these decisions, so let's replace Mark Zuckerberg with Priti Patel and Nadine Dorries. That doesn't seem to be a very sensible way of doing this.
Jim, thank you. Very, very helpful kind of opening framing. Silky, can I come to you next, please?
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to be very brief, because Jim has said a lot that I agree with. In essence, just picking up where he left off, it's not even necessarily that we're handing over decision making from the likes of Zuckerberg to Priti Patel and Nadine Dorries. It's that all of them are going to be involved in deciding what we can and can't say online, which is like whatever the inverse of a dream team is for free speech on the internet. Like they are it. It's all of the things to sum up, I would say all of the things that are bad about online censorship at the moment are about to get so much worse under this legislation, because you've got the politicization and political interference with Silicon Valley speech values for corporate terms and conditions over what people can say online, and a structural abandonment of human rights standards and the rule of law when it comes to free speech. That's what we're looking at. And frankly, how we're in this position and how this issue has been abandoned by so many people is mortifying and a bad reflection of free speech culture in our country. It's almost become like a right-wing issue. I have no idea why. This is it's an everyone issue. But here we are.
Yeah, I think you've seen that across lots of aspects of civil liberty debate over the last 18 months, not just in this context, which I'll definitely come back to. And, the one thing I think has become very clear already is, defining terms of what a lot of what in this draft legislation means is so critical. I want to pick up on a few, but Matt, can I get your opening comments?
Thanks, Emily, and hello, everyone. This is such an important matter, and it's kind of inevitable that we were going to have a moment like this, because what's happened with the technological revolution, if you imagine the invention of the printing press, of newspapers, of radio and television, all being compressed into a 10-year period, that's basically what humanity is now trying to deal with in terms of technological impact. And it's so far dealing with it, as you might expect, with a lot of difficulty, not least because the political class in most countries is not up to speed. Now, this bill is an attempt, a very flawed and actually at the moment, I think, unworkable attempt to deal with that new technology. And the problem is it tries to do way too much. It doesn't define the key terms. We can dig into that a bit more, I hope, later in the thinking. And as Silk said, it hands lots more power to people we don't necessarily want to have more power. It has almost, well, this is perhaps an exaggeration, but it has very little care for the old-fashioned value of freedom of expression, which has very few defenders at the moment. But actually, if you look around the world, it's never been more important. When I just look at what's happening in the autocracies of Europe, what's happening in some of the tort cases in America, what's happening in this country, that it is under threat. It's not a right-wing value at all, freedom of expression. It's the base value of any democracy. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be absolutist in our approach to free expression. Of course we don't. But we do have to, if we're going to embark on a major regulatory exercise like this, start from the proposition that we have a, if you like, a predisposition towards freedom of expression, liberty, and democracy. And this bill is not based on those assumptions. It's based upon some very, very sweeping ideas about what is and isn't acceptable speech or content. And it's far too vague to be in its present form. To be
in any way workable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I pick up on that, because it seems to me that when we talk when we talk about freedom of speech in the context where I sit now on the internet, it seems to be about freedom to abuse people or not, essentially, rather than freedom of expression in the context of democratic versus autocracy in the way that you've talked about in other parts of the world, which seems to have skewed. Maybe I'm reading it wrong. I'm interested in your view, but free, because I want to get onto the concept of lawful but harmful. But it seems to be that we're looking at it very much from that kind of context when we have this debate.
Yes. Well, I mean, and to some extent, there's value in that, because you don't want language that threatens violence or crime any more than, the law already is hostile to incitement to violence and so on. And one wouldn't want to see that kind of content anywhere. It depends what you mean by abuse. I think a lot of people now, by abuse, simply mean language they don't like. And that's a major semantic slippage, which is very in tune with the zeitgeist, which is that there's a sort of right not to be offended, which is absurd. And we have to be very careful that the law, this bill, doesn't import to statute, almost like a Trojan horse, that ridiculous idea.
Yeah, Silky, can I talk to you about lawful but harmful? Because that's in any discussion reading in this bill, that immediately jumps out of how on earth do you define that, both in the context of what I was just talking about with Matt, but the concept of physical safety is more clearly defined. It has precedent. The concept of psychological safety and psychological harm is where we're getting to some much more of the difficult things about this bill. So be interested in your views.
That's right. First of all, to redefine acceptable speech, lawful free speech, along the lines of harm, along the lines of how this nebulous notion of harm, how it's received and interpreted by someone else, is a major step change, and one that's been vastly overlooked. And you would think, in the current context of kind of how fraught a lot of public discussion is at the moment, culture wars, all the rest of it, that we'd be really finely attuned to the risks of taking this route, but apparently not. So the harmful speech under this bill is speech that could have an adverse psychological impact. It doesn't have to be a medically recognized condition. It's just words. And those words are going to be interpreted by politicians and a regulator. And we're going to have to deal with the consequences. So you can imagine, depending very much on the kind of state of our culture and politics and who's in power and who the regulator is, these are going to be very elastic terms. Also, the other part of this definition is that that definition is tied to the groups or people with characteristics who are affected by the speech. So basically, it means that you're not taking a general view on how people would receive the speech to decide whether it's acceptable or not. You're looking at it from the view of people with the characteristics who could be adversely psychologically impacted by it. It's an incredibly fraught area, and for example, and I hate coming to this example because it's one that always comes up and it is a very difficult one, but it came up in the evidence session that Matthew and I did, is when you get into discussions about sex and gender. That is when you can start to see how this definition is going to be very problematic and people are going to have very different views about how it should be applied. And this is the problem. When you detach from rule of law principles and human rights standards, this is a kind of hot water you get into. The whole point of human rights standards is that they are supposed to be, ironclad. They're supposed to not move with the times. They are just, set in stone principles about what's acceptable in case of freedom of speech, the principles that should guide what is acceptable. We don't see that in this bill. And yet, it's being treated like this kind of like sideline technological project that deals with the internet as though that's distinct from free speech generally, so we can just rewrite the rules. That's rubbish. These are the rules that affect not just even us domestically. These are the rules that affect billions of people, that set standards for the future. So the impact is absolutely enormous. Yeah, and also, your point is very correct in the sense that when some people talk about this bill as somehow being the answer, the idea that this can solve all of the issues at all, this is like a jumping off point in some ways. It's a flawed, perhaps, start jumping off point. Jim, I can see you nodding. I wonder if you could talk about the responses. Silky talked about the political responses. Yeah, the tech firms themselves, the systems that they are going to then, and the risks of those, moderation, taking down, that they're going to have to, put in place.
Yeah, well, I think the way to think about this is a consolidation of power. If it goes ahead, as Silky was saying, you have a symbiosis between the secretaries of state and Ofcom on the one hand, and these tech giant leaders, and they kind of deciding what happens online. But that's then, it makes it very comfortable, that relationship. It's going to be one where the tech companies and the governments are going to kind of think, well, great, well, now we've got a mechanism to control all this. Now we have a way to stop certain things or to disincentivize or whatever they want to do, that they've got a kind of close corporatist kind of relationship. In practice, that of course means, as we know, automated takedowns. Of course, that's what it means. But it also means cutting out other parts of the tech sector, the new companies, the challengers. And so in a way, it just reinforces the monopoly and it reinforces the problem. And if we're not taking away, as we're saying, the sort of basic incentives around attention, I also don't think it can be very effective. And Matt said it was likely to be quite ineffective. It's not a very good bill. Well, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the problem here is if you try to deal with the content problems at the margins, firstly, you get all the problems of taking the wrong content down because it's just done by automated processes at the lowest cost possible, as quickly as possible, as thoughtlessly as possible. Well, then secondly, you don't get the mechanisms to actually improve the customer service, the customer relationships, that where we're trying to say, well, we don't like the way that YouTube prioritizes all this content. I want to be able to sort this stuff properly. I want to have an experience where I'm not ever threatened, and therefore I want to be in a safer kind of environment where content is moderated effectively. Those incentives continue to not exist. So we continue to not solve the problem. And so until we basically put people in the center and make competition the issue, right? And particularly say like interoperability, this is a technical word. And I know a lot of people go, what? But just ask yourself, how many mobile phones do you have? How many mobile companies are there? How many mobile phones do you have? You have one. Do you need, a BT phone and an O2 phone and a Vodafone phone? No, you don't. You have one phone and it works with all these other networks. Whereas we have a Facebook account, a Twitter account, et cetera, et cetera. And these silos mean that the entire incentive is about keeping on that platform. You break the silo, you can start making the behavior better. I know that's a long kind of way of saying things, but really that's the right way. And add to that, right, the government is proposing in GDPR reform right now. It's looking at reform of data protection. A lot of this harm or unwanted behavior, all those things, is based on your profiling and abuse of your personal data in ways which is almost certainly unlawful today and could be stopped today if we had an information commissioner that was willing to enforce the rules. And yet the government wants to make it easier to sell our profiles, to profile us, to actually make that attention market worse. So on the one hand, they're trying to regulate the problems. On the other hand, they're trying to deregulate how the problems occur. So I kind of think we're in a really mad situation where the solutions are really obvious: competition and data protection, and the government's going in the opposite direction and trying to kind of have state regulation to police all the problems. Like this is the 1950s or something.
Plenty of content that's out is illegal incitement, harassment at the moment. I mean, how's this? I mean, is there a kind of low-hanging fruit of things that should be being done already, let alone needing new legislation? I mean, Silky, you're nodding your head. I wonder if you wanted to come in then.
Yeah, this is a big issue because at the moment there is a lot of complaining about material that's online that's not being policed, that's plainly unlawful speech, threats of violence, for example.
Yeah.
And it really surprises me, to be honest, when we see politicians who receive this awful abuse, threats of violence, rape threats, all kinds of things, saying, why won't Twitter take it down? I think that's the wrong question it's part of the question to ask, but really the question to ask is, why aren't the police dealing with it? Are people even reporting this stuff to the police anymore? Given the sheer volume of unlawful content online across a whole spectrum, you've got stalking and harassment. Digital stalking and harassment of women is something that hasn't been dealt with properly, to be honest, nor has it been dealt with properly offline, but it hasn't been dealt with properly online for years. And it's such an odd starting point to now swoop in with huge legislation that changes the whole landscape, but jumps in at unpleasant things that people are saying to each other that isn't even unlawful. You would think that at least we'd be looking at getting the cards in order on dealing with the really serious issues: child sex abuse material, stalking and harassment online, threats of violence, threats towards public figures, racism, all of these things that are online that need to be dealt with. And there's nothing in this bill, in all of its hundreds of pages, there's nothing about setting up infrastructure, resourcing, funding, powers, anything around this unlawful material. But the rhetoric that you'll hear from ministers is that it's about targeting this kind of stuff. There's not an iota in here is about actually policing that stuff. It's about telling tech companies, is asking them, can they police it actually? Can they take it offline? It's crazy.
Yeah. I mean, Jim, you're nodding.
Yeah, just a really quick sort of addition to that. I mean, what we're saying, in a way, what this bill is saying is, if you are an abuser, a criminal, someone who is harassing or any of those other things, don't worry, because we're not really going to come after you. What we're going to do is get the tech companies to delete your stuff and maybe delete your account, but you can basically carry on, because we don't care. What we care about is cheap. We don't want to burden the police or burden the courts or really see actual things sorted out. We simply want this problem put on the shoulders of these tech companies to deal with. Now, I can understand that to a degree, right? The problems do seem enormous. There is a lot of material out there. it's sometimes hard for people to imagine how this might be sorted out. But I think you have to sort of ask, well, how does this normally get sorted out? How does law breaking normally get sorted out? Well, you create an incentive on people not to break the law by educating about what is lawful. And part of that is done through prosecutions and actually taking action. So again, I'm very much agree with Silky on this, but I think, there's a sort of attitude in the government that they lost control. They're not going to regain control except through the corporations. So they're going to set up a cozy relationship with these companies in order to get law enforcement and problems dealt with on the cheap. But that's really as far as it goes. I think there's also maybe a bigger kind of question about the loss of control of governments over how they feel they've lost control over the digital space in a way, and they have been given an incentive actually to bash up the companies as much as possible. Because that gives them a certain amount of political capital in doing that, right? So conservative governments, which are, previously been known as being very friendly to business, are suddenly extremely anti-business because they see a sort of political points to be scored. Now, it's not to sort of say there's no problem. It's just very odd that, the last number of Home Secretaries have spent a great deal of time bashing the idea of us having private encrypted communications, telling us all that this is going to cause problems of law enforcement because the police can't read the messages and because the companies can't tell material. But actually, if they get their way, they're going to cause more criminality of a different sort. I mean, it's kind of crazy.
I want to come back to the issue of anonymity because I know that's a key part of this. I want to talk about advertising, micro targeting, and algorithms. I know there are a lot of people in the chat that I'm trying to follow. I really want to bring in my colleague Luke and John Hawksley, who's made a great point. But before that, can I turn to you, Matt? Because of course the bill exempts journalists, or journalism, I should say. There are some instances where deciding who is a legitimate journalist for these purposes is a difficult question in itself.
Absolutely. I mean, a good example of that as a sort of micro case is one of the ways in which Twitter, I think, actually has become a force for good is in the Twitter thread. Some really, really brilliant Twitter threads appear in my feed every day. Now, is that journalism? Some of them are just as good as anything that appears on a major news platform as a column. Are they protected? And if so, who decides? And I think that comes back to sort of who decides question is at the heart of all this. I mean, I really find the lawful but harmful distinction actually deeply alarming, because I want law that is law. I don't want law that then allows a kind of a margin which will be filled by an arbitrary censor, self-appointed, presumably, but certainly a force that is capable of rendering first principle values into fashions that are, subject to the whim of campus activists or people who feel themselves not legally, lawfully harmed, but harmed in any case. That kind of woolliness in statute law is fantastically dangerous.
I don't know. I mean, it's an issue with having this huge piece of primary legislation that's never tested any of this at all. And I mean, as Silke said, there's quite a lot of well-tested jurisprudence on things like malicious communications, point one. And I think point two, and this came up on the day that we were appearing before the committee, there's a really strong case here for going lean with the first iteration of the bill and then updating it every year, as the Prevention of Terrorism Act used to be updated every year. Two cases for that. One is that it's the bill as constituted is far too big, not ready. And the second is that it embeds into the parliamentary calendar the idea of the constant duty to revise and correct course. And has this gone too far? Is this actually over censoring? Which things are we missing? I'd like to see the law be very, very specific. If we want to, for example, outlaw things that encourage self-harm, which I think is a perfectly legitimate thing to say, it should say so in terms in the bill. Yeah.
And ditto the encouragement of suicide and so on. We want law that is very, very clearly stated, and this law is very political in its language. It's deliberately vague. There's a lot of constructive ambiguity or destructive ambiguity.
Yeah, I mean, talking very political, I mean, who defines who a politician is for these purposes, which is another of the definitions.
Exactly.
I mean, how long is their speech exempted? Do you stop being it? When you lose your seat, or when your potential? I mean, I won't go into it too much, but for those listening, it might be interesting. I promised I wanted to come. The chat is Emma J actually made exactly to your point, Matt, about will the bill make provisions for regular review and updating. Matt has given the answer. Luke, my colleague Luke, can I bring you in, because you have been very prolific. Hi, Luke.
Hi, Emily.
Hi. You've talked a lot. I can see about enforcing their existing terms of service, about moderating, not policing. Like, the floor is yours. So. Oh
well, thank you. I mean, the one important thing in this for me is it's definitely similar to what Matt was just saying about specificity, is that there seems to be almost a complete lack of understanding as to how you operationalize this bill, looking both ways, looking through the telescope. One is from the perspective of a tech platform, and I'm thinking specifically here about the category 1 platforms, which will include Meta and Twitter and Snapchat, the big platforms. Because there's no indication at all of how they'll be expected to report on what they've moderated and why. They're just going to be told that they'll have to do so to the satisfaction of Ofcom and de facto to the satisfaction of whoever's pulling the strings at a Secretary of State level. And I just think that's an immense problem, because what we're doing here is deciding, to Matt's point, on a highly politicized point to legislate an industry that we don't understand particularly well on very shaky ground, with no real notion of how it will be done. And I think there are two real harms to be had from that. They've all been alluded to. The first one is obviously that the dial moves over time to include things that are to us now legitimate and meaningful and important types of speech, and starts forcing tech companies to police and remove them. The other implication is that we drive an even bigger wedge between governance and technology, because we've already created a landscape where these tech companies are alienated from the process of, well, getting a bit of feedback, alienated from the process of helpfully trying to legislate platforms. They're essentially trying to race out ahead of them, race out ahead of this legislation, and create new products, new services, new domains in which to commercialize our data before we've even got a handle on the one that we're in now. So I'm deeply suspicious of the bill. I'm deeply suspicious of the secondary legislation that supposedly is going to come and define all of the things that I've just been mentioning. But I think there's a real point to be made right now about Matt's point, change the framing so that it's depoliticized and it's leaner, and insist that we have a proper coalition between government and technology companies today that sorts out how that moderation and policing is going to be done. Because I think if we don't, the consequences are disastrous.
Thanks very much, Luke. I've got I think, listening to everyone, I've got a question as to whether Ofcom is ready for what the increased. No. I know they've been hiring like crazy. I've seen, but I wonder whether they are quite ready for everything from making the codes of conduct, the amount of people who would be referring to them based on the new provisions in this bill. Maybe I'm a little skeptical.
I'd be interested to know what the job descriptions are that they're hiring for.
I mean, I've seen them advertised around. I have to admit, it's not something I've looked into more detail, but I have. Can I go? By the way, I really very interesting. Chris Chadwick's point on offence and on which side. Can I go back to, sorry, because I said over John Hawksley, if he's there. Hi, John.
Hello.
Hi, John. So I just wondered if you wanted to expand on your point about like, what is the purpose of platforms and their choice as to what they are?
I think the legislation needs to distinguish between platforms that are providing a service for people effectively to self-publish against platforms that are interested in what is being published, are pushing information. There's a concern on anonymity, but I think if the law is going to reach to be of any effect at all, the platforms have to be willing to disclose to the authorities where they are where they are facilitating someone to publish, but not curating.
Yeah.
They have a choice. If they're not going to do that, then they have to curate. They have to be one or the other.
Yeah. No, very good point. You mentioned anonymity. Can I ask some our panelists' thoughts on it? And for obvious reasons, if you're a victim, you want to be able to, you are concerned about being able to at least trace individuals concerned. But obviously, there are many circumstances where it is quite vital to keep it. Matt, can I get your thoughts first?
I think it's almost impossible to impose a personalised system. I mean, I think it stops at the first fence, because you can just set up another account. There are kind of third way answers that have been proposed where the platform retains the data and that can be run out of them by means of subpoena. I suppose there's some mileage to that, but I think it's very important to see this in a whole world perspective, which is anonymity on social media is a very important feature of whistleblowing, of democratic movements, of activism in authoritarian regimes. So because really the internet doesn't care very much about national boundaries, we just have to be ever so careful before we leap to the abolition of anonymity. It's very seductive, because the most horrible things said by people every day on everyone's streets, especially women's, by people hiding grotesquely behind anonymity is, disgusting and degrading. And I don't have a glib answer to that, I'm afraid, but I'm slightly concerned that the medicine may not necessarily cure the disease, and also may lead to other problems.
Yeah, I mean, there are kind of technical mini features that you can.
Yes.
I don't know whether you can have more features if you are verified, if you are willing to give more information. Right. You can block people that you don't know from replying to you.
I mean, that seems to me the kind of thing that is best delegated to.
And that's a technical point that are features and products for the for the firms themselves. This is not a necessarily new law that needs to be able to that will ever be able to cover all that. By the way, Liz, very good point in the chat. I completely neglected to say about where we were in this process. A joint committee of Parliament that has been referred to a couple of times because Silky and Matt were on one of the evidence sessions, is collecting evidence right now on the latest draft of this bill, and is going to give its report on the 10th of December. So draft white paper's been published, but really at the moment it's evidence gathering and refining what is, as has been discussed, quite a large, wide-ranging bill that has been talked about for a couple of years. Jim, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just want to make a couple of quick remarks about the anonymity problem. I mean, the first thing to say is that, for instance, in the football abuse cases a few months ago, the vast majority, Twitter claimed 99% of the cases where the police asked for the evidence in order to trace those people, the evidence was there. And that's because the data retained includes IP addresses. Those could be matched with records at the ISPs. Most people who are abusive are not actually really trying to hide their abuse, because they actually think what they're saying is perfectly reasonable and legitimate. I mean, that's the paradox of it. The second thing is that a lot of the people who actually want anonymity, or provisional or not, are in fact people from the groups that we're trying to protect. They're people, for instance, who are gay or lesbian or transsexual who don't necessarily want to come out to everybody at once, or have a different kind of identity online as they do in other parts of their life. You can imagine so many situations where that's true. It's even true of things like trades unionists who might want to be quite provocative in their politics online, but don't wish that to be an issue for their employer that might lead to their dismissal. So, anonymity is really quite a powerful social tool. And as I say, I do not believe that it is a major investigatory problem. At least that's not the evidence we've had. So I think it's basically a bit of a non-issue. I know it's very understandable that people assume that it's an issue, but perhaps it is. The evidence says otherwise.
Yeah, no, and Silky, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Yeah, in fact, Jim and I have scrutinized for over long periods of time all of the laws that we have and technical capabilities that law enforcement has to de-anonymize people online. So sure, it's at the moment very accessible for anyone to have a kind of pseudonymous personality on the internet. It's really, really, really hard if you want to be genuinely anonymous in your internet use. Technologically, really tough to be posting and sending emails, etc., online in a way that can't be traced back to you. So again, it comes back to the rule of law. If someone is posting in a malicious way, sending malicious communication, stalking, harassment, breaking the law online, law enforcement have the legal powers and the technical means to identify them. Almost all the time, vanishingly rare that they can't do that. They're not doing that most of the time. They're doing that when these stories get into the press and it's the World Cup, not just normal football games, and everyone's concerned about racism. But when the rest of the time, when racist posts are being reported, this stuff is not being fully investigated. So again, it comes back to the same issue. We're not having a rule of law approach. And there's no resourcing for actual policing.
And yeah, the existing law is being ill-applied or misapplied or not applied, to your point.
Yeah.
I want to get to the issue of technology, age verification, end-to-end encryption. But I had one kind of question on going back to Ofcom and the point about criminal sanctions for senior managers, which is new in this proposed legislation, and thoughts on how you think that will actually work in practice, because I don't quite understand if it, if you're a director of one of these companies, you face these very, in the government's word, tough criminal sanctions. I don't understand, and this is my question, I don't really understand how that would work. Would it be just a UK based director? Who on earth would want to do that job then, if you are the one that's massively on the hook for this? It doesn't seem to me, again, you can talk tough and political language, but the actual implementation, I'm concerned about. Jim.
Yeah, I mean, I guess they would, assume that people would get a travel ban in effect. But I think it's also about just ensuring fines are paid and so on, and basically getting compliance. But I do think it's a lot of grandstanding, in all honesty. And what I would say is it's a really bad idea. It's incredibly bad precedent to put into law that speech regulations, if not obeyed, can lead to jail sentences. I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, the European Union is copying many of these or looking at copying at many of these regulations. It's looking at whether it should copy the concept of legal but harmful, which is
this is in their Digital Services Act?
That's correct. Yes, their parliament is looking at that, and that would place in the hands, potentially, if you sort of did that and add the jail bit, you could end up with Viktor Orban having the power to put people in jail for, saying things he doesn't like. I mean that's where you end up. So I think you have to be really, really careful. Again, it's just so, to me, it's just really inappropriate to ask a state to be regulating areas of speech like this. at least in the European case, they kind of say, well, we're just going to do what, apart from what Parliament currently wants. It's saying, they want to deal primarily with unlawful content, but they also understand critically that a decision to take down content is not proof that it is actually unlawful. It's a kind of temporary decision, and therefore, or a decision that is, very contestable. So they kind of try to put processes in to ensure that it is manifestly unlawful, not just kind of might be unlawful, but actually clearly unlawful. And then that there are appeals processes on top of that to deal with problems. Even that sort of process is likely to go wrong because you don't generally have good incentives for people to push back when content is incorrectly removed. But at least it's trying to be in the right area instead of this sort of vagueness that we've ended up with.
Yeah. Can I bring in Lucy Huberman? Are you here? Can I bring you in?
Hello.
Hi, Lucy. You've been very active in the chat. I've seen you mentioned Cambridge Analytica. I wondered if you wanted to expand on the things you've been saying.
Well, I was going to ask Matt the same question, really. I think the combination of the history of this legislation, when it started under the DCMS Select Committee that investigated Cambridge Analytica, and Facebook, when Damien Collins and co felt absolutely something had to be done, and obviously something has to be done, the something is the question we're debating, has morphed through changing personnel in government from the online harms bill to the online safety bill. And my impression just from looking at, I haven't looked at the most recent draft, but looking at the debate was that people have been most focused on protecting children. And I think that is the sort of legitimate part of what they're trying to do. I mean, when it comes to the question of free speech and the rest of it, it's very hard. I mean, I've been lots of fora where people have said, we have all of this other existing legislation. How are you going to, codify the crossovers between the new powers and the old powers? And there are no answers. And I agree, policing is a problem, but I do think the companies can do more. I really do.
And Matt,
but I think maybe they can only be incentivized in different ways, maybe not this way.
Matt, I don't know if you had any response to that, but I did want to pick up on the topic of particularly child protection aspect of this bill. But Matt.
Yeah, again, I come back to specificity, which is, who would be against a law on one regulation that included, a very clear, and whatever addenda are necessary for the protection of children that aren't contained in existing legislation. Again, it seems to me that's the sort of law we should be looking for, rather than what we've really sort of ended up with is a kind of jerry-rigged attempt to build up by under another name a kind of codified constitution for the internet within the boundaries of the United Kingdom, which is a really stupid idea. Because we're not remotely ready to do that. So I agree 100% with Lucy about protecting children, but I'd like to see it done in a way that's so specific that it can be argued out on the floor of both houses, discussed again in committee, and so on. These are really big. Each of these steps may appear small, but they're really big. It's an excellent objective as regards the protection of children, but let's do it in a systematic way rather than under huge sweeping statements that really no one has thought through.
Yeah, I find it an interesting time to talk about it because, of course, the age appropriate design code, which is part of, very much related to provisions in the bill, it's been adopted for the last couple of months. It's an interesting. I want to talk about it more, but Silky, can I go to you? Because when I was watching your evidence to the committee in question, talking about the issue of algorithms and in relation to micro-targeting, to scrutiny and regulation of such, I wondered if you wanted to just expand on those points.
Well, I think there's a push through this regulation to open up the inner workings of popular social media platforms in particular to more scrutiny and to more algorithmic scrutiny. And I think there's fairly wide agreement that that's a good thing. Jim spoke about the attention economy, and he's completely right. That, you know, these platforms are built in a way that is designed to be almost addictive. And, you know, I think the writing was on the wall as soon as the like function was introduced to Facebook and then Twitter. You know, that's a very powerful thing. That changes the nature of the social media. We're so used to it, but when you really think about what it is and how it incentivizes use and how it affects people's psychology and group psychology, it's a very powerful tool. It's an interesting thing. And yeah, of course, you know, I think we're also well aware now that they're designed in ways that can lead people on almost extreme spirals through content. On
the issue of advertising, in particular, there are kind of exemptions in this bill from advertising.
I think, I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to, but there was so there was a point where we had a bit of a disagreement in the committee. My point was that granular data collection is central to harms, and also central to how platforms manage to tailor these experiences so that algorithmically you're hooked.
Yeah,
that's through granular data collection, and the whole purpose of that is for advertising. And I felt that the committee and perhaps some of the politicians scrutinizing this or championing this legislation don't really fully understand that. It all comes down to advertising. That's not to say that the adverts are the source of the evil. They're the source of the money. It's the business model. And so that's why the granular data collection matters so much as well. It's the source of all the harms. You would have thought after Cambridge Analytica, given the kind of, you know, in the technological world, the privacy crisis is a bit like the environmental crisis. We've got a lot of spillage, and this point, again, one of the most obvious prescient digital harms that we're facing as a society goes untouched in this bill. Just on this point about algorithms, though, I think one of the things that is concerning is that what politicians want to do is open up tech companies' inner workings to more scrutiny, but also then to have a very targeted input into types of content that they don't want people to see. You know, that's what they're really talking about. They say freedom of speech is not freedom of reach, and therefore we can designate types of information that you can post it, but no one's ever going to see it. Just think about that principle applied, for example, in the context of the pandemic, when there have been, you know, some uncomfortable discussions that have had to be had around public health policies, COVID passes. The Big Brother Watch a couple of weeks ago had our video of David Davis, civil liberties champion, taken off YouTube.
Removed, yeah.
And he was criticising COVID passes. And these are the kinds of difficult areas where we're going to see this new framework that's not a human rights framework, but a corporate one, rub up against our expectations of free speech.
Thank you very much. Can I we are rapidly running out of time, so as we always do when I knew, can I just get Lily Evans in, please, if you're there, please. If you're there.
Yes.
Hi Lily, thank you very much for joining us. You've made
Hello.
a tremendous point in the chat, so I wanted to bring you in, if that's okay. Hi.
Well, I just wanted to say that as I listen to this and as I reflect on the last week symposium where Pippa Norris and Professor Stephen Haggard were among the speakers talking about the backsliding democracy and the examples of 20 different countries, research that they have done, we are basically hurtling along the Hungarian route at a faster rate than they have been. And nobody is noticing. This is the worst part of it. And the whole lot of the things that are happening on the face of it that sound terribly exciting to look at on their own are part of a system that on one hand is undermining rule of law. We have already gone past transparency. Memos are going left, right, and center. Nobody knows. VIP lanes get to be discovered, but money is seeping through. 4 billion for the rail has been sucked into the DH in the VIP lane that is not evidenced at all. So we have, and then we have got the election bill that is going down, undermining the democracy. We have got Dominic Raab, who is blaming judiciary of all things and undermining judicial review. So what are we doing about that on a higher level?
Context. Absolutely. See it in the wider context. Thank you for bringing that in. I'm sorry we don't have as much time as I would like to kind of press and go through that. We've got about a minute left. Can I just go through very quickly our panelists? I've got a few kind of final thoughts, but first, Silky, can I? The one thing we should take away.
The bill. It's
that's a very succinct answer.
Done. Yeah.
Right. Jim, please. Sorry.
A lot of the comments around what is really going on here have been about personal data. Personal data is governed by data protection. That's where we should be looking for many of the cures, along with competition. The online advertising market we've been talking about, is widely thought to be unlawful, and is quite possibly going to end up banned one way or the other in Europe. We're not discussing that here. The whole profiling thing. So there's that. But although this bill is very dangerous, and I really don't like it, I do think it's very dangerous. We have a paradox that also does seem quite unworkable. And I kind of think that's also a really bad thing. It's like proposing legislation that claims to solve everything when it can't is a way of persuading the public that politics, everything is ineffective and broken. And also for the problem to just come back and us have the whole same debate, only probably in a much worse way in a year or two, with the politicians even more livid.
Matt.
Well, certainly, I'd rather have no bill than this bill. If we're going to have a bill, I'd like it to be sent off right quick to a health farm for a big slim, and then, as we've discussed, given much more specificity and reviewed annually. That's kind of my bottom line.
No bill is better than a bad bill, to Leslie's point in the chat. I can only say my reflect. We haven't talked about some of the more specific things about protection of children, which really deserves a significant time to itself. But I mean, the idea that this bill can be presented politically as being the answer, I think is clearly wrong. It is trying to address some problems. At the very best, it is a starting point to try and address them, but leaves significantly more questions than answers. The question of who decides is not answered. Terms are very ill-defined. We're not applying the laws that we already have effectively, so why making new ones is suddenly going to kind of solve some of the underlying problems that we've talked about. And the context of which we talk about freedom of speech is very easy to talk about just in the context of online abuse. I mean, I can only speak personally as someone who's suffered it a lot. I can see why that's attractive to think about it just in that context, but there is a significantly wider one that should not be forgotten in it. And I have no idea if Ofcom is ready for what might be coming. Not least because there's so much more needs to sort out. It talks about making code of conducts that don't even exist yet. So there's a lot more. This is a theme I'm sure we will continue to talk about a lot. Thanks very much to everyone who was very active in the chat. I can see already many of my colleagues who are going to be picking stuff up in various of Tortoise's investigations. Thank you very much to Jim, to Silky, and to Matt. I leave with many more things I want to talk about than when I came. So that's the perfect way to end the thinking. My mind is suitably expanded. So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone joining. We're back at 10 a.m. tomorrow at Tortoise. Tomorrow it's the start of our policing inquiry. Lots more questions about the rule of law and is law being applied there. So please join us from 10 tomorrow. But for now, that's it for this evening. Thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to seeing you again soon.